seems to be insatiable, my appetite for the Bay Bridge. Some of the concerns I have in 1998 when I was a member of the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, when I voted for this design and this project, I was told by experts that it would cost $1.4 billion, and most of the proceeds for doing this seismic retrofit would be paid for by the toll payers. And as I said earlier, I've represented a good portion of them for a long period of time in my public life. I was also told that we could be rest assured that it would be finished by 2003. And that was very important because we were told the high risk of leaving those over 250,000 commuters on the second busiest bridge in the United States of America at risk to another seismic event. Having been in California in 1989, trying to watch the A's and Giants in the World Series when that earthquake hit. So we were told by experts that every day that we left those commuters on that bridge was, quote unquote, a race against time. So the fact that we were so over budget and that we were so late, and in our efforts to make sure that we didn't have a calamity on that bridge, imagine a earthquake on that bridge when the old cantilever was still being used during the peak congestion period, what a calamity that would be for all of the individuals involved, but also for the state of California. So thankfully that didn't happen. We have a new bridge. I would opine that I think it's beautiful, spectacular, and fitting in its setting. However, I really do wonder whether the cost and the delay was worth the beauty and to be determined safety, although I'm very sure that this bridge is safer than the existing cantilever. So with that in mind, we're going to take time today mostly to listen to experts from around the world, and we're very grateful that you have joined us here today, and we'll be hearing from Great Britain in just a moment. But it's also important in the context of the next two prospective large public works projects in the state of California. We have the high-speed rail project, which is currently budgeted at $68 billion by the High-Speed Rail Authority. If you believe some of the writings by Dr. Flyberg, which I had the pleasure of reading this weekend, and his research and what happens with rail projects, should we imagine that the Californians, rather than paying $68 billion, might be spending $300 or $350 billion for that project. In addition, we have the water project that currently is estimated to be about a $22 billion project. So it's in that mind not to be critical, but to take an honest look at this project and learn from our mistakes, if there were mistakes. So this hearing is just to look at the global aspects and the national aspects and the challenges around mega projects, those projects that are budgeted over $1 billion. The other projects I mentioned, I have a new word in my vocabulary after this weekend, giga projects, which are defined as over $20 billion. So can we learn from these things? And I think this is really critically important, not just for infrastructure, but for the public's belief and faith in public government systems and public institutions. And I'm constantly reminded when we've had these hearings, as you read Kevin Starr's history of the Golden Gate Bridge, that when the Public Works Director in the 30s estimated, Mr. O'Shaughnessy, that the Golden Gate Bridge, that icon of California, would cost $100 million, the local elected officials said that that was just too much, that we won't build that. And Mr. Strauss came and said, no, I can build it for $37 million. And then he went out and met with APG&E and arranged for the financing and the legislation that created the bridge district that pays for that bridge as we speak. So that bridge was on time and on budget. Now, I know that when I bring this up in the past, people will talk about environmental laws and worker safety laws, but I think it's also important we measure the difference as to what happened between that bridge and the building of the original eastern span, the Bay Bridge, and the western part of the Bay Bridge. So with that, we will start and we'll go through as the agenda has said, in the order that the agenda has said. For those of you who are joining us and need to look at an agenda, you can get those right outside the committee hearing room, and the sergeants would be happy to indicate where that is and anything else that is in print. So with that, we're going to first go to Alexander Budzier, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, who is joining us from the BT Center for Major Program Management at Oxford University. Welcome.
Thank you. Good morning.
please go ahead with your, the way this will go in terms of just scheduling is we'll go through, or the agenda, we'll go through each presentation by each speaker, starting with Mr. Budzier, and then we will go with questions from committee members. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So I've been invited to talk a little about and put it perhaps into context. As you know, and you alluded to my colleagues' publications you read last weekend, we have over the last 15 years, we've studied a lot of infrastructure projects, and a lot of infrastructure is not on time and not on budget, and it's probably one of our key findings. So as part of our studies, we have studied recently 76 tunnels and 81 bridges that were built from 1919 until, or the decision to build them was made between 1919 and 2001. And for these fixed link projects, we made some very interesting findings. For one, we see that the average cost overrun on a project like this is 34%. And we actually see that 9 out of 10 projects themselves had a cost overrun. So there's a massive skew in cost overruns in these projects. There's also a massive skew towards schedule delays. On average, fixed links have a schedule delay of 23%. And we also see some of the risks that are associated with this is that these things go horribly wrong. So we see very, very large cost overruns in 9% of the cases. So in nearly 1 in 10 projects, it is not just an average overrun of 34%, but a massive overrun of 100% or more. And this is quite unique in terms of if you compare this to other transport projects. And so this is important because often there is sort of the assumption behind this, if we talk to decision makers and decision makers try to understand what risks are inside these projects. So if you compare this, for instance, to typical road projects, those have about a cost overrun of about 20%, in a similar way that 9 out of 10 road projects run over budget. They tend to have much longer schedule overruns, so they tend to be 38% behind schedule versus fixed links only 23% behind schedule, but they don't take as long. And that is one of the things we see, that fixed link project, so on average, building a bridge or a major tunnel takes about 8 years on average. A road project is typically 5.5 years, so it's much quicker, which also means there is much room for any adverse events happening, and therefore for the project being impacted by that. If we then, and you just said that, see the third big mode for infrastructure projects, the transport infrastructure project, is of course rail, including high-speed rail, and those have, again, is a higher cost category. So in rail, we actually see the average cost overrun of a rail project is 45%. And again, here we see that 9 out of 10 projects actually overrun their cost. And average schedule overrun for rail is 45%, and they go horribly wrong in about 6% of all observations that we made. And then let's compare this to sort of what we know is actually the largest or the most riskiest thing one can build in the engineering world, is actually big dams. And those have, we see, so they almost double their budget typically, and they're also 44% behind schedule. So if we look at this sort of in all together, we actually see that all these engineering projects, and I think that's one of the key findings that we made, all of typically engineering projects tend to be late and not on budget. And we have looked into sort of what is the explanation we can find for this. And one of the interesting observations that made us think really hard about this is that over the last 70 years, we actually have not seen these numbers shift. So I said this, and when we look at this, at these tunnels and these bridges, decisions to build a bridge in 1919 qualitatively not any better than the decisions we make about them today. And that's very surprising given all the innovation and all the research that has gone into the engineering science of this and the technological science of this and the technological science of managing projects and so on. And we actually believe that those improvements that were gained on that side, so on the downstream, on the execution side of projects, are probably mostly upset or offset by increasing complexity of schemes. The Oakland Bridge, again, broke an engineering record, which a lot of these projects tend to do. And there's this specific sublime in doing that, and this is a very specific motivating factor. And you also retold the story of the San Francisco, of the Golden Gate Bridge, and where we actually see exactly that same dynamic playing out over and over again, but not in a successful way often. And we identified two driving factors that might lead to these cost overruns. And those are, on one hand, that risks are misunderstood, and on the other hand, that risks are misrepresented. The typical literature will also list a third cause for cost overruns when we look at particularly why did people get the cost estimates wrong in the first place? Why did they think we can build it for so much cheaper than what was not possible? Or why would this thing be so much quicker than it was actually built in the end? It is technical error. So there's a lot of argument around that we need better data, better models to do this, but we actually can see that sort of our data show with overwhelmingly statistical significance that that is not the case. So this is not because of error. These findings, these cost overruns, these schedule delays are because of bias. And when we talk about bias, then we need to talk about two factors that drive that, and one is optimism, and the other is strategic misrepresentation, or in simple terms, lying. And so we see there's a lot of optimism that people believe they can finish a task much quicker than they actually can, and therefore, and similarly, or a task at much less cost than it actually takes to finish this task. And at the same time, if we have increasing pressures, for instance, to get a scheme started because of restrained funding and competitive bidding with other schemes, we actually see that project promoters are often most likely to misrepresent the risks and the true cost and the true schedule of projects to just get going. Because once a project has started, it's very rare that, particularly infrastructure projects, that those are abandoned. You can probably find about a handful of examples around the world when an infrastructure project was started and not finished despite cost overruns. And so we actually believe that to learn from this and to prevent these massive overruns and these massive schedule delays, one of the key aspects is to establish realistic, unbiased cost estimates and schedule estimates in the first place, and to be able to also catch project proposals that have been misrepresented deliberately in order to get the scheme approved, to make the cost-benefit ratio or the benefit-cost ratio look nice on paper. And we actually find there are some steps that can be taken to do that. And so looking at the literature that has been suggested by our colleagues around the world, but also looking at what good organizations in the public and the private sector are doing to prevent these things, we see sort of an organizational development in roughly 5 steps. And so the first one is where people or organizations do a proper due diligence of projects. And this goes often hand in hand with the full business case as sort of in the typical approval process after environmental impact assessment and the full business case is presented, that there is a quality assurance or project assurance function that's very data driven. When we've seen taking, and here we see the key to that is actually to take an outside view. And we found it most effective to address things like, or to catch optimism bias and strategic misrepresentation in projects by simply asking the question is, what did the last 20 people pay that try to do something similar? And or what did we pay in the last 20 instances where we tried to build a bridge through the same people? And often we find that taking this step, this outside view, really helps in not viewing a project as unique and made up of unique building blocks, and therefore it circumvents the optimism that is often built into estimating how long a task will take or how risky a specific piece of work is. The second step we see organizations taking is then actually making this mandatory, not only for the one-off huge big project where they hire external advisors or they do it in-house, but where it actually becomes a part of every quality gate or every stage gate that the project has to report into. So we see that the portfolio itself of all the initiatives in a department and even cross departments is managed in a centralized way, that the projects are scrutinized in a similar way. Again, using same or similar tools of actually providing a review of the peer review of the project, so forcing people to take an outside view and not being sort of confined to the frame of thinking that comes with having an inside view of the project. And then the sort of the next big step, of course, is, or not of course, but the next big step that we actually see some organizations taking is really thinking hard about incentive alignment, because often we find that the incentives to be optimistic about a project, the incentives to show that the project has more benefits in order to get it started, the incentives to actually get a project started, or the incentives to just do are very different. The people that profit from that are very different from the people that actually have to pay. So we often see that these layers of who is paying whom for what, so from the taxpayer to the state government to the local government to the delivery authority and then the whole supply chain that's actually constructing and planning the project, we see very often these incentives are not very well aligned. And so we've seen, and we've increasingly met organizations doing our research that really think hard about how to get these things lined up and looking at interesting ideas of how to best do a pain and gain sharing with subcontractors and builders, how to avoid disasters, because we also have seen a lot that where a concessionaire decided to build a public-private partnership at a toll road, for instance, and then construction costs spiral out of control because of politics, which they were not able to control. At the same time, the toll regime is sort of set in stone already and can't be changed, and which forced the whole scheme into bankruptcy, and that has happened multiple times. So in that sense, it is really interesting, or it is a good thing to actually understand, and this is very unique to each individual project, to understand who has which incentives and do they actually line up. And then the third or the fourth aspect is that we see people taking is a lot of focus into the programmatics. So to have a proper program management on board, and that is conventionally something that everybody would always say this is very important, and then with that comes a lot of discipline. And from the media reports sort of that we followed about the Bay Bridge, there was, of course, at least there were issues raised about lack of quality control and all these things that led to some stories that surfaced and additional costs to retest some of the underwater work. So, and that is, but it comes into this places in does the executing authority, so does the owner really steer the project, and do they have the discipline, the programmatics in place, the monitoring and the control, that they actually can deliver this project and actually know where it's going. So that's, and we've seen sort of comparing. So in the fifth step a lot of people are taking is actually the realization that these are particular challenges. And these are also particular leadership challenges, both for the political side, as well as for the civil service side, as well as for the construction industry side. And there is often a big skill gap between delivery authorities and the supply chain. And we often find that project managers for these particular big projects, very good project managers are needed who can actually offset often the tremendous experience that big construction companies will always bring to these contracts and these construction projects. So, and we've seen that some organizations have identified this, that this is leadership challenge, where where project manager or program manager has to brief from the minister and the secretary on the political level down to the people at the coalface in the supply chain, and that requires a very specific skill. And often the skill is lacking. So we've seen some organizations and some countries around the world that now take first steps seriously in actually thinking about this and what do we want? What is really the leadership challenge in delivering these big infrastructure projects, and how can we better address that? And so we've seen, for instance, the UK government, but also the Danish government and the French government are currently doing it on the national level, where they actually see this and invest heavily into building, in particular, the leadership capabilities of the project manager of the biggest projects, and sort of making them, we sort of dubbed it, making them master builders. And so we see this sort of as the fifth thing that organizations are doing with an increasing maturity. So just to wrap up again, sort of from our research, we actually see there's a lot of cost overruns, there's a lot of schedule delays, there's also a lot of benefit shortfall, particularly on toll roads. And that goes with the bigger size in the schemes, and it also goes with the longer duration it takes to build these schemes. So the increasing complexity of them is inviting errors and disasters to happen. So in order to counteract that, we actually find that it's very important to really take an unbiased view of project proposals, to really do the outside view, the project assurance right. And we believe that having that data-driven is a very good way of circumventing optimism bias and strategic misrepresentation, where we find at play in most of these projects when they go wrong. It is also very important to get the programmatics right and the discipline right, but also to set up the right structures, the right incentives in these big projects as the key reasons why people are not pulling on the same side. And then, in the very last step is then we feel or we see that there is a gap in the recognition or lack of recognition that these are very particular leadership challenges, and therefore require particular skill set and capabilities on the program and project management level to be able to execute these projects successfully.
Thank you for joining us. I know I believe you're 9 hours ahead, so you're beginning your Thursday evening. I'm going to wait for most of the questions, but you did trigger one thought when you talked about master builders and people who have a record, and I think you said that both the French and the UK government has sort of tried to concentrate on good behavior and past practices. So in this state, we've had a number of issues, mostly at the local level, of changing the pre-qualifying conditions when somebody bids on a project. So if somebody has done something over and over again that is unethical, illegal, incompetent, you incentivize them not to do that behavior because they're not they're struck from being able to even bid on the project. And frequently this is with subcontractors. I know in my instance in local government there was a subcontractor who put fire sprinklers in schools, and in this instance, in my instance, in a juvenile detention facility, and they were faulty. So the remedy was, and they kept doing it because there was no criminal penalty. They were sued civilly, but apparently they built their business model assuming that the risk was worth it. It seemed to me be incredibly unethical to knowingly put sprinkler systems into a school or a juvenile hall that wouldn't work. So what we did was we changed the pre-qualifying conditions, that if there was a history of this, that don't bother applying. So I wonder if when you look for a master builder, while you're trying to encourage good performance, you're also trying to eliminate people who've had poor performance.
Of course. No, I think that's a very good point. It's the positive side of that tale or these narratives and these projects that we see is actually there's a big push towards earlier contractor involvement. So we often seen as as there is a big challenge, so a lot of investments go into infrastructure projects, but capital productivity in infrastructure projects tend to be low, hasn't really improved with other investments. So there is a particular challenge, and we see how this is being addressed across the board and in the industry. And one of the interesting bits of that is, of course, digital engineering, which seems to be a huge value driver for the future. The other thing seems to be early contractor involvement, which makes it very interesting because, again, it puts very different requirements into the selection of contractors, because suddenly the cost-benefit ratio of a project, or simply the cost, don't become the single decisive factor anymore. It is more about how can we identify good behaviors that we wish to have in our supply chain, and how can we then select and contract with those that show these good behaviors. And often we find there is procurement laws are very complicated. It's a very tedious process, and very often companies win because they're very good at managing the procurement process, but they're not very good at executing. So that in itself is very interesting. We see there are some movements, but very slow movements, where not only pre-qualification of bidders is a step that people take, but also actually to identify what are good behaviors that we wish to see in our contractors, and how can we select them based on that, instead of just looking at who has the lowest bid or some innovative approach to that to some extent.
Thank you. So I'm told you're going to stay with us for a little while here. If that's not possible, please let us know. But we're going to go through all the presentations and then try to ask questions and have maybe a group discussion at the end. So our next presenter, as a native of Massachusetts, I'm pleased to have Virginia Greiman here. She's a professor at the Kennedy School of Government and Law School at Harvard University, and she's spent a good deal of time studying the Big Dig in Boston. Welcome. You push the red button there. We're all set. You're good. Push it again.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here, and I hope I can assist you in your tremendous obligation and responsibility to the citizens of California. I've had the pleasure of serving on several mega projects in various capacities, including the Big Dig in Boston. At the time, the country's largest mega project, but that's since been replaced in California. And that was a $15 billion project, started out at $2.5 billion. In my capacity there, I served as deputy counsel, deputy chief counsel, and risk manager. I also now serve as a professor at Boston University in Megaprojects and Planning, at the Kennedy School of Government, and at Harvard Law School. I have continued my advising on many major mega projects throughout the world. So my comments will come both from my experience and from my research. You have a tremendous challenge ahead of you, and lessons learned are very important and must be shared. And my hope today is to introduce some thoughts and ideas for further discussion. I would like to begin my comments by saying, what is the ultimate outcome, or what is a good definition of project success? And I believe project success is really not about what we refer to in project management as the iron triangle, cost, schedule, and scope. I believe projects are about sustainability. And as legislators, you have the responsibility to deliver a sustainable project. That means a project that will last its intended lifetime. I will applaud you for the fact that you designed a bridge that I understand will last 150 years. I would say that was a very good decision and a very good benefit for California. Most important is that what you are building, and as legislatures, you have awareness and intelligence constantly throughout the project life that requirements are being met. because that is what makes a project successful, meeting requirements. Long after projects are built, the public tends to forget, as we have in Boston, yes, there was a cost overrun. Yes, there was a great delays. Yes, there was inconvenience. But in the end, they can now get to their airport from many locations in 30 minutes instead of 3 hours. The air quality, the reduction of pollution, the caring for our sea life, the building of benefits for small businesses in and around the Boston area and throughout the country in some respects. The ability to work with the stakeholders and the local communities and make their quality of life better. These are very important benefits, and we read so much about what goes wrong in projects, about the project failures. I recently completed a book on megaproject management where I try to provide some balance, not only about the problems in projects, but also about the benefits. As government organizations, we do not do a very good job of communicating the benefits of these projects to our stakeholders, because we often get bogged down in the day-to-day details. I'm going to briefly summarize what I think is important for you at the outset to take a look at, and that is your governance, organizational, and financial structure. I will be happy to answer, of course, any questions on this later, but to have a successful project, first of all, your strategy, your mission, your goals must be very clear from the outset. On the Big Dig, we had one major goal, and it drove everything, and that was a safe project. If we were not operating safely, our contractors had the ability to cease operations. Yes, ceasing operations causes delays, but it also saves lives. I think it's very important for project owners, for governments to decide at the outset what is going to drive your project. Is it good risk management? Is it quality assurance? Or is it going to be a schedule-driven project? Unfortunately, as I look at projects around the world, too many of them are focused on schedule. Amazingly, incentives are given for being on time, but disincentives are never given for being late. So I find sometimes our performance criteria is not clear. Our performance criteria and recognition should always match our goals. Projects need to be structured in a way that they can perform and meet their criteria, but also the owners, the project owners, can know at any point in time what is going on in that project. You need data, you need important information. We had an oversight commission in Boston, which was of great advantage to us, an oversight coordination commission, which coordinated state audits and what I will call forward thinking between three major agencies, our Attorney General, our Office of the Inspector General, and our state auditor. They coordinated audits. They coordinated necessary project intelligence and information that was needed. They provided us with great value. I believe one of the greatest attributes of projects is the ability to have strong project intelligence, so you know when you're in trouble. If projects are over budget, if projects are late, there is something systemically wrong with that project. Once costs start rising, they will never stop unless you make a major transformation. There's a reason why costs are rising. There's a lack of discipline. There's a lack of proper structure. One of the questions that was posed to me before the hearing was the importance of project finance. I cannot stress that enough. If the money is there, it will be spent. If the private sector does not have a stake in the game, they will, of course, continue to come back with greater needs, as will your stakeholders and your community representatives. We require states, many states in our great nation, to have balanced budgets, but we never seem to require that of projects. I do not understand that, because I do think projects should have a requirement right in their specifications of balancing their own budgets. Projects should also have requirements of meeting schedules. And there should be a clear understanding of when schedule delays are caused by contractors and the owner who owns that risk. Quality assurance, absolutely critical in projects. Having an oversight authority that is constantly watching quality is absolutely critical for project success. Having an oversight authority made up of a group of citizens, a citizens committee. On the Big Dig, we had many separate stakeholder groups. I gave them work to do because I felt they were an important part of our project. They could be very helpful to our project. They could provide us feedback. Stakeholders play a very important role, and we need to give them more responsibility, authority, and bring them in as our partners. You have a very long project, long in terms of duration and long in terms of miles, and I respect the fact that you will have multiple stakeholders all over the state of California. It's important to engage them at the very beginning and set up an oversight authority made up of your community representatives. And of course, you need technical oversight. You need to know that the requirements that you have set forth are being met. As legislators, you need project intelligence. You need to know the questions to ask. You need to have timely reports. And you need to have the ability and the authority to know when the project is in trouble, and you need remedies to be able to address those concerns. I really believe that, as Winston Churchill said, planning is important, but plans are useless. The one thing we do not understand about megaprojects is that they are constantly evolving organizations. They are constantly changing. Stakeholders will continue to have concerns throughout the life of your project. Those benefits need to be assessed by expert panels. Innovation needs to be encouraged. We strongly encourage in megaprojects value engineering programs, quality assurance programs, strong risk management, and recognition when the participants are contributing to the project. I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have, and I am very happy to be here and share with you some thoughts on lessons learned.
Thank you, appreciate it. You brought back many memories of sitting in traffic on the Southeast Expressway.
Oh, yes.
I had a lot of good excuses for not getting to work on time at the Pemberton Square Courthouse.
Absolutely, we all did.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I particularly think your comments about the external costs that weren't anticipated. So in the Big Dig, you wonder what the Quincy market, what it was before. It was a place to go, as I remember my youth, and have waitresses at Durgan Park insult you for a piece of prime rib.
Oh, they still do.
They still do that. But now it's a vibrant part of the city, and you can walk to the waterfront and the North End. I think most people in Boston would who have a memory of what it was like before, probably without knowing the numbers, would just sort of say whatever the investment was worth it. So it would be interesting to have a discussion about how you measure those external things, or at least have some back of the envelope understanding. As somebody who spent most of my life in the restaurant business, I assume most of those service industries around the Big Dig have benefited greatly from that, and the secondary benefits to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and the city in terms of tax revenue is probably a very positive thing. I wonder if anybody's ever attempted to measure that.
Yes, that's a very good question. A report was issued in 2006. The data from that report, I think, would be very useful for you, and it included minority and women business development statistics, small business development statistics. We measured these throughout the life of the project, and these were presented during our communications to the public, which became quite frequent, so that the public could actually see as the project evolved how benefits were being measured and determined. This included, of course, the reduction of congestion, a much better structural integrity, because our highway in the sky was about to collapse, as you may recall. It was built for 75,000 vehicles, and during its peak years, it had 175,000 vehicles on it. It had huge environmental problems. Those have actually, the benefits have been calculated in this report. There's continuous ongoing studies, as there should be, and I'll be happy to make the reports that I have available to you.
That would be helpful, and it'd be interesting to see if there's an optimism to some of those numbers when you start. So we're being told, for instance, for our investment in high-speed rail, that the economic activity around the rail stations will be a certain amount. If you look at past history, at least in California, for MTA and for BART and for the other transit agencies in the urban areas, there's definitely a connection between the development around the stations, and this is true for Europe, of course, and Japan, probably even more so. So getting those numbers right, it'd be interesting to get those numbers, but also see what the margin of error might be, similar to the work that you've done in the UK about the margin of error expected historically. So helpful. I should have said it, my Boston accent, which I've lost in
Yes, you
35
have.
years, is Durgan Park.
Yes.
Yeah. Wicked good. Go Red Sox. Okay, so we will now go to William Ibbs, who's a professor of civil and environmental engineering department at the University of California, Berkeley. Go Bears.
You got it. Thank you, Senator. It's a privilege to be here today and to offer some thoughts on important questions you and your committee are facing. In addition to being a professor of construction management at Berkeley, I'm also a consultant and have been involved in various project management and construction management organizations. So a lot of what you're hearing today is going to be reinforced, I believe, by all four of us. My thoughts that I'm going to share with you are formed by over 40 years of large-scale construction project experience on projects around the world, including various nuclear power plants, the Big Dig. I also was involved in the Big Dig, where costs went up by a factor of 3 or 4, depending on what your starting point is. I'm currently involved in the Panama Canal right now, where the costs are going up by a factor of 2 on that. They're doubling on that. And I've been involved in various rail systems around the world, including BART, the LA MTA, the Copenhagen Comet system, the Johannesburg How Train project, and the Shinkansen in Japan. And I think this hearing is very, very timely, not only because of where the high-speed rail project is, or program is today. I think it's also very timely in terms of the spin-off benefits that can accrue from this project, spin-off benefits and costs. With unemployment at very high rates here in California, and with small businesses and large businesses struggling a little bit, this program, this high-speed rail program, and I would call it a program, which is a collection of different projects rather than an individual project. This program has a lot of consequences, not only to the engineers and the laborers and the riders of the rail system, but to the communities that surround it. I think it's therefore critically important as California undertakes big projects like this, gigaprojects, that leaders such as you really have a good understanding of, the full range of consequences of these types of projects, because they affect not only I think of it as in terms of concentric circles, if you will. They're the benefits and costs that accrue to the people that are immediately involved in the project, the carpenters and the train operators and the landowners. And then there's a second level of concentric circle that's the small businesses and the communities and the populations that live in the communities. And then a third concentric circle that oftentimes gets ignored is what are the consequences of this project or program overrunning to other projects and programs that are on the table, prospectively on the table for the citizens of California. If this project overruns its $68 billion, the high-speed rail project overruns its $68 billion project budget, that's going to have consequences to other projects that will not get launched and will not get finished. And we need to look at it, I think you need to look at it in a holistic way. Like some of the other speakers have already addressed, my main points, one of my main points of today's presentation is that I think that it's important to look at projects and programs in a multi-perspective way. Cost, of course, gets all the headlines. Cost escalation gets all the headlines, but also important is schedule, quality, and underlying schedule, quality, costs, safety is the idea of project scope. And whenever we talk about projects such as the Big Dig increasing by a factor of 4 or the Panama Canal increasing by a certain amount, you need to compare apples and apples. You need to say, all right, the budget at this point in time was X, and the budget, the final cost of the Bay Bridge, for example, are $6.4 billion. But the Bay Bridge that we just recently completed is not the Bay Bridge that we anticipated back in 1989 or 1991. Things get added on. Once a project like a high-speed rail project gets launched, it gets a momentum, and it gets a kind of a Velcro characteristic where it's nice to put other features on that project. I call it the Christmas tree syndrome. So you start off with a Bay Bridge plan in 1991 that's just going to repair the existing bridge, the existing eastern span, and after a couple years of studies, people decide that it would be more economic to actually build a replacement structure. People study that for a couple years, they develop designs, and then that design, which had a commitment from certain leaders, was derided as not being aesthetic enough or not having enough features. So we scrapped that, quote, freeway on stilts design and came up with a signature suspension span. That's all well and good, but when you start adding things, more things to a project, invariably the costs are going to increase, the schedule is going to increase, and the functionality of the project is going to increase. So you need to look at all those things together. In the case of the Bay Bridge, one notable Christmas tree ornament that we put on the bridge was a $180 million bike path. In the case of Copenhagen rail system, halfway through the project, they decided to improve the handicapped access facilities at a cost of over $100 million. And in Johannesburg, the $4 billion rail system there has mushroomed up over $6 billion, in part because of added small business enterprise programs that they decided were meritorious. In fact, all of these ideas are meritorious, whether it's Buy America, whether it's small business, whether it's disadvantaged business programs. All of these ideas have merit, but we need to look at the costs and the schedule and the quality impacts that arise by adding on to the scope of the project. It's important to look at not only the capital costs, the front-end costs of building these things, but it's also important to look at the operating and maintenance costs that will result from building these large-scale projects. Something like the high-speed rail is going to employ hundreds, if not thousands, of people directly, and there'll be spin-offs associated with that. So when we look at budgets on projects, we need to really understand what is included in that budget and what is not included in that budget. Elon Musk's recent Hyperloop proposal, for example, did not consider O&M costs. It only looked at capital costs. And that, the capital costs are headline grabbing, and they're a single point number, and they're nice to look at, but people in your position need to make decisions about projects that have not only capital cost implications, but O&M cost implications as well. And a lot of those downstream costs are very hard to foresee. We at Berkeley have benchmarked over 200 large construction projects around the world, including the Big Dig, and frequently we found that the compounding that arises with these projects, as was previously mentioned, doesn't just add 10% or 20%, but oftentimes 100 or 200% or more. As an example, the U.S. Department of Energy is building a nuclear waste treatment facility in the state of Washington right now, and those costs, the capital costs, have mushroomed from $2.5 billion to at least $12.3 billion in the space of less than 12 years. In the meantime, the project duration, the schedule for that project, has expanded from 12 years to at least 19 years. And that has repercussions, obviously, to the treatment of that waste, to the functionality of that project. I must say that these types of issues that we're talking about today are not new issues. There were studies published in the 1970s by Dr. Ed Merrow from the RAND Corporation that looked at the cost performance of what he called pioneer projects, one-of-a-kind types of projects. And in a way, the high-speed rail project, I would argue, is a one-of-a-kind type of project. And Merrow's work identified that not only did you have cost growth and not only did you have schedule growth on the construction side, but even after a year of operating those plants, nuclear plants, solar plants, syn-fuel plants, even after operating those plants for a year, about 80% of them fell short, far short of what their intended production capacity was. So again, it goes back to when we talk about these projects and we want to benchmark these types of projects, we need to compare apples to apples. What did you intend to build at one point in time, and what did you end up with, and how does it compare? How does the operation compare with the planned operation? So what can be done? I've got three specific ideas, solutions that I would like you to consider, you and your staff to consider, and I take these out of the private sector and also what I have seen other public entities pursue successfully. Number one is to make full use of various computer-based tools. There's new technology called Building Information Modeling Systems, BIM software systems, that allows the designers and the government agencies to look at the design of a project from an inside-out point of view. They can look for conflicts between the plumbing systems and the structural steel systems, and they can identify those clashes before you hire a contractor and actually encounter those problems in the future or in the field. So BIM tools would be one idea. A second idea I'd like to propose is the idea of what's called Integrated Project Delivery Systems, IPDs, Integrated Project Delivery Systems. And this may seem a bit radical for a public agency, but I can assure you that it's been tried and tested in other countries around the world. An IPD is actually a contract agreement between the government agency, the design firm, and the key contractors. They sign a joint pact at the outset of the project whereby they establish a scope and a budget on the project. That budget includes a profit for the different parties. And any cost overruns or underruns are shared by the parties, including the government agency. So some of the cost savings can be returned back to the government agency to use in its mission for other projects. This goes to some of the comments that were made earlier about aligning incentives. It also goes back to some of the comments that were made earlier about early involvement of your contractors. Getting the contractors involved while the design is still fresh and on paper rather than being built out in the field is an economical and prudent way. So getting your key contractors involved early on the project, and Caltrans and other government agencies, by the way, have made steps in that regard when they've moved from what we call design, bid, build projects to design, build projects, where one party is hired to do both the design and the construction. That's a step in the right direction, and I think IPDs can help us take the next step. The third and last suggestion I have is the idea of establishing a compact between the governor, the legislature, and the High-Speed Rail Authority. A few years ago, and I speak of this personally, a few years ago, as you may remember, the University of California and the Governor Schwarzenegger, reached an agreement which, though it wasn't technically legally binding, there was a moral suasion behind it. And it laid out the idea of some cost savings in early years and some guarantees in return for later year funding. So having sort of a super agreement, if you will, between the key parties, the key political parties, is something I think that's very important. One of the messages I think you've heard from the other speakers is that these projects are not just about engineering and construction, they're about political processes. And I would urge you and your colleagues to look at what can be done institutionally from a political framework point of view about better managing these projects, and that includes holding the parties that are involved to account. Those are some of my thoughts. The idea of using BIM tools, the idea of using integrated project delivery systems, and possibly the idea of establishing a compact arrangement between the key government agencies. I appreciate the opportunity to share my ideas with you today, and I would certainly welcome any comments or questions that you have.
Just since I'm getting in the practice of asking each one of you one question, so how would you enforce a compact between the legislature and the governor in different administrations, especially over a long project?
Well, I'm not an attorney, so I have to give you that disclaimer.
I was thinking of some kind of punishment for us.
Physical
punishment.
Of course, your punishment is getting voted out of office, okay? And
that might not be a punishment.
I'll let you make that decision, okay? But I really think that, elevating the importance, elevating the discussion about projects and elevating and reminding people about what were the original terms and conditions by which the parties agreed is one way to just keep going back to, this is what we agreed to. If you want to add a bike path, that's fine, but It's going to change the whole dynamics. It's going to change the cost, it's going to change the schedule, it's going to change the functionality, and is the public prepared to pay for that?
Right.
I guess it boils down to a benefit and cost discussion and a long institutional memory.
And in that instance, of course, the bike path so far has proved to be very popular, but it doesn't get you all the way across the bay. It just gets you, eventually, it'll get you to Yerba Buena.
My wife and I and our dog were out there the second week it opened, and it really, I'm not sure I would have paid $180 million for it, but I was happy that we added it to the bridge.
Okay. So that will, Mr. Thompson, you've had a few of us mentioned high-speed rail, so we welcome Lou Thompson, who's the chair of the California High-Speed Rail Peer Review Group. He's also a former railways advisor to the World Bank. Welcome back.
Senator, thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to address this subject today. It's a matter of deep personal interest to me. As you may know, I began my career as a project manager, engineering project manager in the private sector. Then I worked for the U.S. DOT, including running the Northeast Corridor project, which is still the largest rail passenger mega project ever managed in the United States in the public sector. And I have acquired scars and gray hair to tell you about on that project. I worked for the World Bank for a number of years, overseeing all of the investments that the World Bank made in railways worldwide and the things that happen, plus and minus, on those projects, including supporting for the franchising program that we push to get private sector more involved in the operation of railways. So after that, I've been a consultant in this area and have spent many, many years worrying about these problems. I have to say it's frustrating to be the last speaker, and if this happens again, I'm going to ask you to be the first speaker because, first of all, there's so many ideas on the table, it's hard to know what to make of them. Second of all, basically, they've said much of what I want to say, and I agree with it, so I'll only address some of these things pretty briefly. First of all, mega projects are not projects. They start off as visions or big ideas, okay? And to think of them as a project is just wrong. They don't become projects until much later in their life. At the beginning, they're an idea, they're a goal, and a concept, and then gradually over a period of time, they become something like a project, or some pieces become projects. The problem with this approach to life, which is inevitable, is that you end up with a scope on the one hand and a budget on the other hand, and they are never the same. And getting them to coalesce is the challenge of a project over a long period of time. But at the beginning, the emphasis is on the idea and how do I sell the idea. The emphasis is not necessarily on how do I make sure everybody knows what we're going to get into when we really start this project. Second, mega projects inherently are public as well as private. They cannot be private. They are public, they affect people, they affect everybody in the public in a whole bunch of different ways. So you can never have a simple mega project. There are always, you referred to them as Christmas tree ornaments. I've used the word barnacles, which sometimes I think is a better word, but they always acquire other things that have almost nothing to do with the objectives of the project. Also, public management of the projects is not the same as private management. And we inherently, I don't think we've ever sat down, and I would recommend that you do this, and make a very explicit list of what would a private manager have to do as opposed to a public manager. What are the flexibilities and the freedoms of a private manager as opposed to a public manager? And I think when you make that list, part of your explanation for why projects have real problems will be on that list. The things that public managers cannot do, and I have been through all of these, that private managers can do or don't have to do, that restrict the way in which the project can be planned and managed. I agree that the so-called iron triangle does not measure the outcome of a project. Clearly it does not. A good example is that if you build the high-speed railway and demand is half what you think it is, that will not be a successful project, even if it is completed on time and on budget and the scope that we expect. So much more than just the technical issues and the budget issues, or what are we trying to accomplish in an output sense, and did we do it? And I'll come back to this later, but the French government has a law which they've applied to all of their high-speed rail projects, and I think to other projects, that says we must have a post-audit of this project, and it must be reported publicly. What did it cost? What was the schedule, et cetera? And then what do we get for it? Is the economic rate of return what we said it would be? Is the financial rate of return what we said it would be? And that there's a wonderful discipline in that. But it has to be formal, and it has to be required, and it has to be something that everyone sees on every project. Otherwise, it loses its value. I think that the benefits and costs of a project can be defined, and they must be defined, and the time to do it is at the very beginning. Now, I agree with the argument that projects acquire other objectives as the project goes along, and I want to talk about that in a minute. But you certainly could have and must have at the outset a clear statement of what are we trying to achieve? What is it going to cost? What we think the schedule is? What do we think the budget's going to be? And what do we think the outputs are going to be? Of course, at the beginning, these are all probabilities. None of them are known. And the earlier in the project, the less it is known, and the more uncertainty it's subject to. But the only way you can evaluate the outcome of a project is, what did you expect? And how did it come out? How did it compare to your expectations? And again, the way you do that is by requiring clear definition at the beginning, and then by forcing all changes to be explained against what your expectations were. All estimates are always subject to optimism bias. The only time you finally find out what it's going to cost is at the end, not at the beginning. And there is always optimism bias, and there is no way to get rid of it except if those who make the estimates have something at stake. As long as the estimates are made by people who don't have anything at stake, then optimism bias prevails. If they know that at the end of that project, someone's going to look over their shoulder and say, you failed and these are the consequences, there's a very different attitude toward the estimates that you get. It is very difficult to tell you what uncertainty really is, especially in a public forum. You tend to get an estimate that says, well, maybe it might be low, maybe it might be high, maybe it might be in the middle. But it's very difficult to explain what a probability distribution is. And yet, most of what we know about projects at the beginning is that there's a probability distribution, and we hope that it narrows over time. But it's really hard to explain how those interact, and it's especially difficult to show how those can interact to produce a really bad outcome. Good outcomes are great. We love those. But what we really need to know is, what's the probability that this thing will fail? Now, in the private sector, what happens is that they do these, and then if there is any sizable probability that they're really going to lose, they ask serious questions, really serious questions. If you're risking the company, you don't want to do that on a 20% probability. You want to know it's much less probable than that. I don't think we should be calling these projects. I think we should be calling them programs or processes or something else, because they're not projects. Prop 1A, as I said, was a proposal, a goal, a concept. It didn't have a budget, it didn't have a schedule, it didn't have a defined scope. What it was an aspiration. It didn't even have a way to pay for it, part of it, but only part of it. The question was, how do we reduce this aspiration to a project? And we haven't done that yet, to be very honest. We're working on it. And I would say that the progress that's been made in the last 2 years is really very manifest, as we said in our last letter. But we're not there yet in terms of having a project. We have a project in the Central Valley for part of the Central Valley, but the rest of it is still much more of a program than it is a project. And I think you should think of this in terms of oversight. I think you should think of this in terms of a program, not a project. It's not something that will happen and then can be forgotten. It's something you're going to encounter it year after year. And so you should see it in terms of, what's our long-term goal? What are the issues that we've addressed this year? How did things change? Do we want those changes? Do we accept those changes? What's the next year's objectives? But it is not the kind of fire and forget that you can do with a repaving of a part of a highway. Mega projects like this one, the Big Dig did not, but the high-speed rail will. That's a PPP actually, although we don't have the third P in there yet, or maybe, we don't have the second P in there yet, but we will. These are a lot more complicated. They're more complicated because the form of the project is more complicated, and they're also more complicated because the public sector is not well equipped to deal with the private sector in this way. They're one-of-a-kind agreements. They take a special understanding of risks, of investment, of rights and responsibilities. These are talents that we typically don't have in state agencies, and acquiring them and making sure that we have them is going to be extremely important. Another factor that we need to take into account is the federal government. When they pay, they call a lot of the tune. They do not necessarily require the things that we in the state would like to have them do. but yet they impose significant constraints on the way the money is programmed, on the way the money is spent. So we need to make sure that we've considered the role of the federal government whenever a project comes together, a program comes together, and we need to understand what happens if the federal role changes or does not come through the way we expect it to come through. What could you do about these things? These are some thoughts that I have, especially based on what I've heard now. The first point is, if you're going to affect a project, do it at the outset. As soon as the money is available and the concept is funded, it becomes much more difficult to influence it. So the primary emphasis is to make sure at the very beginning of a project that you've got the best possible definition of the benefits and the costs, and you think it's worth it. Granted, those will change. Granted, new things will be found. Granted, problems will emerge. But at the very beginning, there should be the clearest possible definition in dollar terms, or at least as close as you can to that, of what do we get for this and why should we pay for it? Because once that stage is passed, it becomes a lot harder to control a project. If you foresee a private role, the second P, then bring the private sector in as soon as possible. Do not make their decisions for them. This is a risk that has been posed in a lot of projects, and it certainly is a risk here, because the private sector would like its own voice in engineering detail and operating plans and demand forecasts and all of the other things that are important. So the longer you wait before involving them, the harder it is later on to get them involved. Make detailed use of impartial experts. Impartial is a person who is not being paid by any of the parties to the proceeding. We've tried in the PRG to serve part of this role. The university system in California is superb. They have the best experts in the world. Make as much use of them as you can, because they're impartial and they know what they're talking about. Put in place a reporting mechanism where you say these are the objectives that we're trying to reach at a level of definition that's useful to you. Not, I want 37 feet of rail that weighs 150 pounds, et cetera. But what are the objectives that you're trying to achieve? And then regular reporting against those objectives that say, 1, here's what we've achieved, 2, here's what we changed since the last time, and here's where we started. So you have a much better picture of what's going on in the project. The problem that I've run into is that you have a tendency to get a 2,000-page report. Now, what do you do with that? And how do you evaluate it? But if you have a clear, useful set of objectives and what you're trying to achieve, you have a chance of managing it. The LAO, I've made it a point to read their reports, and I think what they do is excellent. They're a very, very good body for telling you exactly and helping you follow exactly this kind of question. Other than that, any questions you have, I'd be happy to try to address.
I'm sure the author of some of the LAO's reviews on high-speed rail, current and former, appreciate those comments.
I knew that.
Well, again, I just want to thank all of you before we go to questions. And I did want to mention to the general public, so this is the first hearing. The second hearing is to be determined. Our calendar roughly right now is to try to do these hearings between now and maybe the end of January. We have, I want to thank the Pro Tem and his staff for allowing us to hire extra staff. We are going to use the subpoena power as needed. We're hoping that Caltrans and private contractors and others will be forthcoming with information, so we won't have to use that legal instrument. But again, thanks to the President of the Senate, we've been given a large deal of discretion as to how we approach this because of the importance of it. So that's to be determined as the second hearing, in my mind's eye, is to at least get a draft on our investigation and potentially call witnesses to that hearing. And the last hearing, prospectively, is what do we do in regards to Caltrans and the delivers of this project, would include the partners at TBPOC, California Transportation Commission, and the MTC to what kind of things could we introduce statutorily or work with the administration from an administrative standpoint. So when we get done with this, we'll hope that this will be the beginning of a relationship with all of you that we can access, and we appreciate your help with this. And if all goes according to plan, you might get a very fine resolution from the California Senate for your efforts that you can put on a wall with all those other proclamations. I would like this to be as free-flowing as possible. Since I'm the only member here, feel free to jump in. But I wanted to sort of go through each of your testimony and just some questions that came up to me, and then talk about some more general aspects of this project and others. So would start with Alexander in London. And one of the things you said, Alexander, I think is amongst the many great quotes here, is that some private sector people may be good at managing the bid process, but not so good at actually delivering. So some of our preliminary discussions with people who are involved with the Bay Bridge, just the issue of what the project Oversight, T.Y. Lin was responsible for, what was Caltrans responsible for. So we can talk about the political governance, but then there's the governance of the management structure, and how change orders came in and how effectively they went through a grieving process with TBPOC and with Caltrans. So in your history in looking at big projects around the world, could you go a little further about the dynamic of, I think engineers' estimates, people want to get them as low as possible to try to keep the cost down. But then we are told that these private sector companies are very sophisticated, probably more sophisticated than the regulatory agencies. They have models so that they look at their potential risk, and before they even put the bid in, they've had some calculation and some modeling as to where the change orders might come in to make sure that the risk is transferred, in this case, to the toll payers as opposed to the private sector companies. So perhaps you could talk a little bit about what your research has found in regards to the bid process, what we might be able to change on the bid projects for these big projects.
Yes, and absolutely, it comes down to the very simple fact that typically the profit margin on a change order are much larger than the profit margin on the initial contract. So, and we see there is, and one of the driving forces is, of course, if you tender out a contract for a fixed price, then there will be a risk involved in that, and that risk is priced by the private sector who's bidding on those contracts. So one of the ways where we've seen how this can actually be changed is, one is the earlier contractor involvement. As we just heard, if you get private sector in, they don't make the decisions for them. So one way to do this is get the contractors involved in early design work before the bid starts, but that has or requires a different setup of how the bidding is done over time. The other thing that we've seen, and that was also mentioned here today, is good use of BIM, building information modeling, or digital engineering, as it's also called, to actually drive out the guesswork and the uncertainties. And we've seen that is particularly interesting because the uncertainties in the project and the uncertainties in, is it constructible, where are the risks, where's the design detailed enough or not detailed enough, those can be driven out by using digital tools and by particularly enforcing through that collaboration and a better understanding of what it is that is need to be built. So what is not only the input of the project, but also what's the outcome and what's the output of the project, that there is a joint understanding across the whole value chain of people that have to work together on this project. And so to get these risks down that are leading then to prices and higher contingencies that everybody factors in is really getting the guesswork out of these early stages. And so what we've seen interesting approaches in that is early contractor involvement. The other one is digital engineering tools.
And are there, in your look at these projects, we've all mentioned about consequences and accountability. So in the private sector, if they miss their business model, are there consequences? Do we know that people have been terminated or not promoted which may be contradictory to what happens in the public sector because of the protection and the culture around those public sector organizations.
Yes, and so when we talk about that, so sort of the other bit of it is also how do we hold people accountable, particularly if, for instance, the taxpayer or the state is financing a project and then there's a local authority, and how people, coming back to my earlier point of the whole incentives schemes and layers of incentives, is in we've seen an interesting approach here in the UK where the Department for Transport is delivering light rail that is very much under the control of the cities. So when costs are put in and design changes are made, that comes often out of special wishes and the Christmas tree ornaments that are put in there by the local authority. And then there's the supply chain that actually wants to have some change orders and just happy to put those through. So we've seen interesting tiers of how that is managed, particularly using things like a quantified risk assessment. So these projects have the quantified risk assessment. They have done the Monte Carlo simulation and things like that, and they come up with probability levels of what they expect the true cost will be. And here the Department for Transport has set out a rule that they say, well, so this is our estimated budget. If it falls below that, then we share the profit of that with the local authorities and with the contractors. If it goes above the estimated budget, we have put in contingencies up to a P40 or P50 level. So the most likely expected contingency of cost overruns. If it goes up that, we finance this half from the Department for Transport, and we finance it half out of the war chest of the local city. And then, but if it goes above that point, all of the overrun has to be financed by the city. So in that sense, they found this as a way of using what they did, the quantified risk assessment, using that in then an agreement in a delegation agreement with the local authorities, and then those would use that in their contracting with their suppliers to actually have paying gain sharing and think very cleverly about this. And well, if you have a little cost overrun which is expected, that's fine, but if this sort of the barnacles and the Christmas tree decorations become obsessive and way too much, and that's really driving this, then it's actually your responsibility. Then you have to pay fully for it.
You mentioned that change orders are more profitable than the original bid. Is it possible to put a range in there that change orders could have a cap on? I see heads going up and down both ways. Have you looked at anything like that? Because in this project,
there's an interesting approach that the Norwegian government did, which every big project that gets started needs to have a list of functionality and a list of scope that is pre-negotiated, that will be reduced and taken out of the project if other change orders come in and cost overruns or schedule delays happen. And so every project from the outset has to exactly say, well, if something happens, then, or if this doesn't go according to plan, then here are the 10 things we could do without. Interesting enough, of course, they find that all of the projects need to take out at least 1 and 2 of these items. Most of those need to take out 5 out of the 10 items they need to suggest for that.
So, but just on, maybe if you know what the range of profitability is on change orders, have you done research for that? It's greater than the original bid, but you don't have a range.
No, I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Have any of you been able to look at the private sector modeling when they come in and bid on these projects? Is there something wrong with our bid process? For instance, the idea of having pre-qualifying conditions where if you've got a history of bad behavior, you're going to be disqualified from even applying. Sure, Professor.
Yes, absolutely. There's a lot of features. There's a lot of different delivery techniques that the private sector uses today that the public sector is precluded from using. I talked about design build is standard operating procedure in the private sector. It's a rarity in the public sector. Pre-qualification is more of a rarity in the public sector than in the private sector. You talked about the delisting or debarment of bad behaviors. That's standard operating procedure in the private sector. Another idea is co-locating people. So a private sector owner who's building a project with a contractor will actually put his people side by side in the same office to get that day-to-day collaboration. There's a whole raft of ideas that the private sector is using that I believe could benefit the public sector. I'd also like to add on that I've looked at, and other people have looked at, change order markups on public projects. And first of all, most construction contracts mandate what the markup will be on a change order. That's known going in. So there are limitations, and those are known by all parties before the project even starts. And after all, the public agency doesn't, in many cases, does not actually need to accept a change order proposal from a contractor. Not all of them are mandatory. But the last point I'd like to make in this regard is that many contractors, not everyone, but many contractors would prefer to build a project that doesn't have a lot of changes on it. They'd like to get in and get out, and they actually make more money on the base contract work than they do the change work. Thank you.
Mr. Thompson?
Yeah, I wanted to make 3 observations. First of all, based on experience, a fundamental problem with public procurement is that it's an adversarial process. We are not on the same team. I'm trying to get something and you're trying to get as much as you can out of whatever it is I want. And fundamentally, that does not produce the kind of partnership or teamwork that you would get in private sector procurement, where you know that you're going to have a longer-term relationship and you're much more flexible. The other problem with the adversarial relationship is that the private sector has more weapons than the public sector does in responding to these problems. The second point is that actually, the High-Speed Rail Authority is trying to use design-build, and the basis of design-build does bring the designer in at a much earlier part in the process. In principle, that's a good idea. The challenge, however, is that you haven't shed the supervisory responsibility. You have to know exactly what you want, and then you have to be able to supervise that design process, and that plays against the public sector requirement for personnel and bureaucratic requirements to get the resources you need to supervise. So that's a challenge. The third specific point for the high-speed rail, however, is that we aren't just building a bridge, we're building a private business. We're building something that will compete with airlines and buses and other things, and that is a very different end result than the end result for a toll bridge or for a typical facility. So the need to have the private sector involved in that is different, because then you want to know, what is it you want us to build? What performance specifications, what designs, what kind of standards, what should the stations look like? A lot of other questions which are quite different than just bringing the private sector in at the design build process. So we have both of those challenges on this project.
If I may
Sure,
add,
Virginia. There you go. If it's red and it's on.
Can you
you're
hear
on.
me?
Yes.
Very good. A major problem, I think, on mega projects in terms of procurement is the federal government's requirement on many projects of the low bid process. Contractors get very good at being the lowest bidder, and you find many times it's the same contractor getting the bid. That is a huge problem competitively. We need to look more at the best value models. If we do look at best value, we can introduce innovations into our procurement process. Rewards and recognition for value engineering proposals in the bids, rewards and recognition for quality assurance proposals in the bids, and for good risk management. So I think how we structure our procurement process is very, very critical. And as to the change orders, we actually did a study of change orders on the Big Dig. And I would just like to say briefly, Quite often, when you see changes growing, again, you have to look at the root cause and the systemic problem. Quite often, it's design development. It's disputes between the designer and the contractor, which hopefully you'll avoid on a design build rather than a design bid build. It's a lack of allocation of proper risk. Too often, the owner owns that risk, and that is problematic. It can be avoided. And finally, I would just add one more, lack of enforcement. Are you enforcing your requirements and making sure that there is full compliance?
I was curious, Virginia, I was going to go to you next. Being someone who reads the Boston Globe almost every day for nostalgia reasons, if nothing else, we all talked about transparency and accountability, but what's the role of the media in all of this, and how important is your relationship to them? We've talked about stakeholders. The media played a very large role and continues to on this project. And of course it did in Boston. They were very active.
I'm so glad you raised that question. When the Big Dig began, we had a very small media department, 2 people. By the end of the project, that had grown to about 12 people. The reason being that you have to constantly work with the media on a daily basis. We were very good about updating the media on the great technical marvels of the Big Dig. But we did a poor job initially of informing them about critical risk exposures, budgets, schedules, and scope. That changed about 1998 when we held weekly meetings. The media came to them regularly. We provided data and reports. We provided extensive information about the Big Dig, including accident rates, claims and changes. As those meetings progressed, fewer and fewer people came. So I would say to you, meet with the media often, provide as much information as you can, mega communicate, and I think you will find after a while they recognize that yes, this is a transparent project, and I can get the information I need.
I wonder if any of you could comment a little further. My own belief is, and I think for those of us who run for office, we deal with the media frequently, particularly when we're in election cycle. And different politicians have different relationships with the media, as all things. One of my frustrations is that I think there's what I refer to as a bunker mentality sometimes in these large public institutions, and true for large private institutions, I suppose, too, where they're, rather than being transparent and honest, it's more about marketing once again. You're a project proponent, but also in that regard, spinning, trying to take something, let's go to the bolts on the Bay Bridge. Clearly, it was a difficult issue for Caltrans and TBPOC to deal with, and I think eventually they did a reasonably good job. But in that instance, we still have a situation where a lot of the general public thinks that they're at great risk driving across that bridge. So changing a culture in large organizations and knowing, having read about some of the challenges in the UK vis-a-vis the Channel, and having been and met with a group of MPs within the last 2 years in London and talked about the effect of the Channel's challenges with the media and then a prospect for expanded high-speed rail in the UK. So just sort of best practices, seems to me that when we look at the Washington State Department of Transportation, they have gone to a model where it's still the iron triangle of on time, on budget, but the most important part is when we make a mistake, we tell the public through the media, and we take our lumps. If it's unfair, we just accept that. I wonder if you could respond to that. Maybe Mr. Bedsaver.
I absolutely share your observation and also to build on what Virginia said, is in the bunker mentality is often then something is systemically wrong.
Right.
And it's not just a bunker towards the media. Often we also see that if something goes wrong, then they stop communicating, and they could stop communicating to their politicians. They stop communicating to the politicians of the opposition.
Right when we get to opposition, he stops.
Transparency. Yeah.
There you are.
Absolutely.
Go ahead. You're coming through. loud
Oh,
and
sorry,
clear.
I didn't get cut off. I said it well, sort of communicating to all stakeholders is really important. And the media is one of those, but also local communities and the politician and the opposition in the legislature. All of these people need to be communicated with, and that really requires a structured approach and a good strategy, and needs to be really taken seriously.
This is sort of a global observation. So when we've talked about the bridge through a couple of different media outlets, completely separately, they talked about the Rogers Commission. I think Mr. Thompson was here when we talked about this. The Rogers Commission that looked into the shuttle disasters, and Dr. Feynman, who wrote the Minority Report, is Nobel Prize laureate. So one of the things that Dr. Feynman said in his Minority Report, well, the quote was, if I'm getting it right, for new technology to work, reality must take precedence over public relations, because in the end, Mother Nature cannot be fooled. So he opined that if you gave the engineering community at the front end, because we've talked a lot about the front end, this is what your objective is. So in the shuttle example, it was we needed to get satellites into space, and we needed to repair them. We wanted to be aspirational. Americans didn't want to say we're going to end manned space flight. I think Dr. Feynman would say that was a mistake. We should have just gone with, this is what your object is, this is what we're going to do. So in the eastern span of the Bay Bridge, the basic engineering problem was to get people from in between Oakland and Yerba Buena Island as seismically safe as possible. Now, I wish I had had the ability to talk to all of you in 1997 before I voted for the project. But what drove a lot of the discussion was not that discussion, it was the aspirational aspect of it. And that's why we chose this design. And in my view, we're sort of shepherded to this design because early on, the technical design people, we talked about a cable stay version, for instance. Mm-hmm. It wasn't either the full Christmas tree or a freeway on stilts, as they called it. There were other options. So I don't know what they call it in Boston. It used to be the Mystic River Bridge when it was old and ugly.
It's the Zachem Bunker Hill Bridge.
Oh, beautiful.
Had to make everyone happy.
Yeah. So I wonder, it's just when we look at things like high-speed rail, the water project, if the basic premise, if you just take the engineering premise and start from there and try to narrow that down and have a compact over the course of the period of time in the governance structure, how much of a difference do you think it would have made in this project and other projects? Professor Hibbs.
I think one of the gorilla in the room that we're talking about is communications. And being able to explain the status of really complicated endeavors to the lay public. I think that Caltrans did some good things on the Bay Bridge. I think they could have done better on other things. I think the website, the ongoing website that showed the progress of the project and various YouTube videos were really informative and helpful and good outreach. One of the tools that the private sector uses extensively is the idea of dashboards, reports that are a one-page, oftentimes a color-coded register or spreadsheet that depicts in a very quick sort of way, what the status is of a project and its different attributes. I forget whether it was Churchill or Mark Twain that said that, if you want me to write a one-page speech, it's going to take me 3 weeks. If you want a 3-page or a 30-page speech, I can do it in a day. But being able to boil down and crystallize key points in a very crisp sort of way is really important. And I must say that we at Berkeley, if I can put on my educator hat for a second, we at Berkeley who are training engineers are really working with engineers to explain to them and help them learn how to communicate complex ideas in a 30-second elevator pitch, if you will. Engineers like to give you all the facts and maybe even more than that. But being able to boil it down to a sound bite, 15 or 30 seconds on TV at 5 o'clock is really an important part of engineering, of an engineer's job these days, or any project manager's job. Being able to explain not only to an educated and an interested person such as yourself that explain to the TV audience what is the status of this project that we're spending their money on and we're building in the midst of their community. Being able to explain that crisply and clearly and succinctly is really an important skill that project managers need to have.
Well, that's a good point, Professor. So Senator Cannella, who's an engineer who's on this committee, and I have a statement he wants me to read into the record before we're done, but at one of the hearings he just said, and I hope he won't be offended by me putting words in his mouth, I'm an engineer. If I'm the project engineer, I lose my license. So specifically, I think he was talking about the share keys.
Yeah.
Who was the person responsible?
Yeah.
And they should lose their license was the inference. So maybe you can respond to that.
Yeah, we do have, a lot of public agencies. I want to say, first of all, they're made up of good-hearted people and well-intentioned people, but they're oftentimes siloed. They're oftentimes responsible for certain functions, and there's a lot of them that come into these meetings. And a contractor or a design engineer that's on the other side of the table to discuss issues generally has more authority and a broader perspective and broader responsibility on a particular issue. So with a shear key issue, you could have a structural engineer in an agency, you could have a corrosion engineer that's talking about the reinforcing steel, you could have a procurement specialist that's talking about the buying procedures for the materials. So one of the things that I think public agencies could benefit from is a more holistic and a more integrated approach towards project management rather than this siloed mentality.
That goes to accountability as well. So I'm assuming if the private sector person at that table gets something wrong and there are negative consequences in terms of profitability,
Right.
there's a consequence for his or her career. In the
that-
public sector, is that different in your view?
It is different.
And why is that?
And there's civil service protection, there's tenure protection, there's all sorts of institutional boundaries and constraints that we have decided to put in place to protect those folks, and those, it's more freewheeling in the private sector.
And I wouldn't, I would
both have their-
defend, I would defend a lot of those things to protect people
Yeah.
when they are abused. But on the other hand, I often get constituents and people from the media go, has anyone been fired
Right.
on the Bay Bridge project?
You talked about the Challenger explosion. There were, I have colleagues that were involved in that study. I have colleagues that were also involved in the Deep Horizon failure in the Gulf of Mexico. And Professor Robert B. at Berkeley, often talks about engineering failures predominantly being rooted in the institutional, organizational, and people issues, and not the technical issues. Okay, it's not the compressive strength of concrete or the corrosion of a bolt. It's who made a decision to insist on a bolt that was 32 feet long and placed in some hard-to-access problem. It's those types of issues, the people, the institutional, the organizational issues that are really important.
So we've seen committees in the history of this country abuse this process and go after people unfairly, but on the other hand, there's sort of a cultural defense to keep the public and its representatives from finding out who was responsible. So some of what you said diffuses
Yep.
because of bureaucratic constraints. It might be design, some people might suggest.
It might be, and I think of it as a pendulum. We can go too far one way, and we can go too far the other way. We can coddle people and protect people and not hold people accountable when they should be held accountable, and we could unjustly release or punish people when we shouldn't. So, I think we need to look at it in that balanced sort of way.
Mr. Thompson?
Well, one of the key issues here in accountability is time. In fact, most of the people who make the decisions on mega projects are not around when you find out what the outcome is. So holding them accountable is not possible. It's a good idea, but you really can't do that. But I did want to add, I think aspirations are important. We don't do anything without aspirations. The problem is to keep them clean and to relate them to the cost and the schedule and the other implications that they have. Did anybody ever say by switching on the Bay Bridge from the from the freeway on stilts to a magic statement. Did anybody ever say the price for that is $4 billion? Now tell me, is this really what you want to do? Was there ever a decision point like that? And that's the problem. That you start out with an aspiration, someone adds another one that they've always wanted to add, and someone adds something else, and you never have a decision point in the process in which you say, well, wait a minute, this is worth it, but this isn't. And unless the process can be structured that way, and I go back to the original point, unless you do that at the beginning, then there's going to be no way to control it, or very hard to control it later
So
on.
that's a good point, and it brings us to two projects, including high-speed rail, which, as you know, I didn't vote for. Not because I don't believe in the vision, but I don't think the approach will be successful in the long run for a variety of reasons. And I think the approach will change for a variety of reasons, because I think it has to, and I think it is as we speak. So in my personal experience with the bridge in 1998, when I was asked as one of 7 local elected officials to vote on this design, we weren't given much choice, but the information we were provided was $1.4 billion. And what you got for $1.4 billion was a bridge completed in 2003 that we didn't get, and that it would be it would last for 150 years, and it would be a lifeline bridge defined as being put back into use, maybe not full use, within 24 hours of a seismic event. So we don't know if those latter parts are true or not, but to your point, and this is the same from my perspective with all due respect on high-speed rail, I didn't think the information I was getting as somebody who doesn't have a graduate degree, has a bachelor's degree in history, and is a generalist, these are complicated issues for politicians to understand. So you defer to the experts. If the experts aren't being forthcoming for whatever reason, it's a real problem, which goes to a larger problem, and the ultimate accountability is in California. The California Transportation Commission says we're $300 billion, roughly, short on just our operational and maintenance needs for our existing infrastructure in an economy that, again, is growing, and we've got lots of problems, particularly, well, in the urban areas, but with companies that are global companies that demand mobility for their employees and for their customers. So we don't have enough money, and we have no funding source to maintain our existing infrastructure. Our only capital improvements are largely financed from external funds and from local sales tax renewals. So we know we have to go back out to the public. When we do focus or polling groups, we know the public says, I'm not going to trust you because of what happened on the Bay Bridge and what I perceive as happening on high-speed rail. So similarly, in the UK, you look at the Channel, and it was a wonderful aspirational, traveling on that is a wonderful thing. But the modeling isn't right. So as I understand it, the debt service was extended because the private sector didn't get the modeling right. So the public pays one way or the other. So to your point, it's a long way of getting to your point that the people are gone, but the consequences still exist for the general public. And the general public actually votes against their best interest because of our poor performance in the public sector.
Well, if I could respond, as you know, the peer review group has said that collectively we like the idea of high-speed rail service in California. And we've tried very hard not to take a pro or anti position on anything, because that's not our role.
Right.
What we have tried as hard as we can to do is to make sure that you know what the uncertainties are, and that there's a wide range of outcomes. There's not one outcome, and they can interact in ways that produce all kinds of ultimate results. I think that the High-Speed Rail Authority in the 2014 business plan will do a much better job of presenting this to you. The problem is that there is no certainty now. No one can tell you, or no one could tell you then what the bridge was going to cost, no matter what they said. They really couldn't tell you. And no one can tell you now. What they can tell you is that it might be here, that there's a range of outcomes. And yet you have to make a decision. And that's the dilemma.
It is a dilemma.
And the hard part, and this is where the press comes in, because the press almost never understands risk until later. At which point, if it didn't turn out the way you said it was going to, then you get killed. But in the process itself, it's very hard to explain that you're making a decision under uncertainty and that it may not come out the way we think we will. And my experience with the press is that I always return phone calls, always, every time, and always try to say exactly what I think about it, because later on it takes away this sense of kind of betrayal. You didn't tell me this. I didn't know how this one could turn out this way. But they function as a kind of an amplifier, and when you put the microphone too close to the speaker, you get a destructive feedback loop, and you can get that in the press in both directions. And the only way it's fixed is by just constant, open, this is what I think, this is what I know, or I made a mistake.
My experience with the press is they're all brilliant, they're all geniuses, they're all very attractive, and I do whatever they ask me to do.
I never
And it
met
served
one
me
who
well,
didn't, I
too.
never met one who didn't know more than I did about the subject that we were talking about, that's for sure.
And I do appreciate, Mr. Thompson, the distinction between your group and the High-Speed Rail Authority. But this brings me to another sort of general question. In the shuttle disaster, they talked about, and I can't remember the expression, but it was basically institutional acceptance. So they kept studying the O-rings. They kept coming back, all these experts saying, there's a problem, this is going to be a problem sooner or later. But people accepted that risk. So this goes to what the Sacramento Bee's written about, of conflicts of interest. And just the ability, as I think Mr. Thompson said, or Professor Ibbs about the University of California, but you all work in an interconnected industry, so to speak. And at least the public perception is, I think someone said that you should make, I think it was you, Mr. Thompson, make the most of truly independent advice, so people who aren't getting paid. But it's hard to disassociate that. And I wonder, Virginia, is that an issue that came up in your
It's a
research?
huge issue in all mega projects, and understanding conflicts, because the government wears many hats. They are the guardian of the public interest, they are the regulator, they are the promoter of the project. Sometimes they are even serving in a managerial role. And I don't think we really understand the risks that conflicts play. I often say to managers, project managers, is your public-private partnership a partnership or a risk? Because we really need to understand those relationships, how we come together and take two very different cultures and bring them together to be able to manage, to share knowledge, to recognize when there's problems and to deal with them together in a partnering relationship rather than an adversarial relationship. Conflicts are epidemic in projects. They're constant, and we don't really look enough at the impact they have on our projects, how they cause costs to escalate, how they cause decisions to be made that maybe aren't good overall and in the best interest of the public. So conflict management, and another point I wanted to make is every major mega project, or a program as we often refer to them, requires a change manager, someone who's constantly watching the ball and recognizing when change is needed, because if we are not addressing the fact that we need change and someone is not watching it, it gets lost, and consequently we need to do something transformative that we're not, because everyone is too focused on details rather than the overall big picture.
I think it's important to realize how big these projects are that we're talking about. I mentioned the waste treatment plant in Hanford, Washington. That's this $12 billion project, and Bechtel, who's the engineer contractor on that job, currently has 2,200 people on that project, okay? The Panama Canal currently has over 7,000 people, from laborers to engineers to project people. The How Train project in Johannesburg had 9,500 people. We're talking about something the size of an Army division, basically. It's just a lot of people. It's not only a complex project in terms of the technology. The Panama Canal is not only complex in terms of the technology, it's complex in terms of the politics of the situation, the financing, and then just the people. To deal with some of these last two issues we're talking about, size and the media, a lot of these big projects, private sector companies employ sort of a two-headed approach where they have a project director or a project executive who is predominantly Mr. or Ms. outside, interacting with regulatory authorities, interacting with the press, and then they have a project director or project manager who's more concerned with the inside aspect. And I think that type of tandem works very well on these big projects because, again, they're generally being constructed very much in the eye of the public, and you need to have a media-savvy person. You need to have a regulatory-savvy person who can represent the interests of the project. And then you also need to have somebody who's managing the internals of the project, too.
I'd really just like to maybe wrap up with one other question, and it goes to, I think Mr. Thompson talked about this. So I find myself, and someone who has an office in this building referred to some of us who are questioning this project as not being enlightened enough to understand the importance of vision. And I certainly don't want to feel that way. I want to feel like Teddy Roosevelt had a vision when it came to the Panama Canal when we started that. So but the other thing is, for instance, in the Big Dig, there was a lot of conversation about, well, we've got this choice of investing all this money in this one segment of the Massachusetts infrastructure, but what happens to Worcester and Springfield and the rest of the state? So I find myself in this position very much feeling the same way, and it goes to high-speed rail. One of my concerns about high-speed rail is we don't have enough money to maintain the existing system. This is just my perspective. So when is the right time that we can afford aspirational, and why is it, at least in the instance of the Golden Gate Bridge, which is such an icon for Californians, maybe it was just that Strauss was a miserable genius of an engineer who got that project right. But somewhere in there, there's this conundrum of structurally looking at what we're doing, and I'm hoping we can continue this discussion and have some specific ideas from you. I think, Lou, the idea about what the French do, French are quite brilliant, naturally, to look back and sort of do root cause and look back. But some of these suggestions would be terrific in terms of just doing something practical when we come back in a session. But it ends up, especially as Californians, where we want to do things that are aspirational, that are big. It's part of our culture. People try to replicate that around the world. You go around the world and they want to replicate the Silicon Valley, and my response is good luck, because it's part of our culture. People come to California and think they can fail 5 times and then become a billionaire the 6th time. So you want to continue that spirit in this state. You want to be aspirational, but you also want to be functional and responsible. Otherwise, you lose the maintenance and operations of your existing infrastructure because there's not enough resources. So as someone who's going to be put in this position again in the next 3 years, I wonder, just a general observation or advice, because all of you have had experiences around the globe, and if we get these things wrong, it's not an isolated incident where we can shrug our shoulders and go, well, that's too bad. The economy will overcome this and we'll just move along. There are consequences, whether we can identify them or not, for lack of management or the perception of lack of management. So I wonder if any of you have any closing comments sort of in that spirit.
This is where I think data becomes very important. You have to be able to show that your aspiration will return benefits, and those benefits exceed just the idea of a big vision, because you're absolutely right. When someone has a vision, they want to see that vision through. Mm-hmm. And it's not always the best alternative. Sometimes vision shouldn't go through. I think in the case of the Big Dig, there was not only an aspiration, but there was more to it. We had a structure that was about to collapse, so we needed alternatives. So it was a different situation in that there was a need. We had no alternative but to go underground and to tunnel through our inner city if we were going to produce a product that had sustainability. So again, I would just like to conclude with the importance of being able to justify whatever you are doing as being sustainable and delivering benefits far into the future.
My first thought is good luck with this. How's that for succinctness? No, this is not a small project in an isolated corner of the state. This is going to affect millions of people, and it's going to affect wide swaths of the environment, wide swaths of the geography. So this really is a consequential project that we'll be looking at positively or negatively. Our children will be looking at positive or negatively, and our grandchildren will be looking at for generations. So I really think that we need to be open, that the authority needs to be open to looking at some of the best practices that come out of the private sector. I talked about IPD, Integrated Project Delivery Systems. I talked about benchmarking. I talked about simple and sweet reporting mechanisms, dashboards that quickly and crisply convey the status of the project. And then also I think that accountability and being willing to hold people's feet to the fire, which I see as part of your job, is going to be paramount in this. I'll also just say that the private sector is not standing still. Other public entities are not standing still. There will be new tools, new concepts, new approaches, new management techniques that emerge over the next 20 and 30 years as we build this thing, and we need to be open to incorporating and adapting those ideas. So again, I think there's a lot of opportunities here, not only on this project, but institutionally to help the state. I do think it's going to have profound repercussions. This project's going to have profound repercussions to a lot of different constituencies. I hope we get it right, and I'll just say good luck to all of us. Thank you.
If we get it wrong, there may be consequences for the University of California. So,
Well, the high-speed rail project is different from many mega projects because you haven't made all the decisions yet. Basically, the only commitment is to the Central Valley portion and to the two bookend portions. So you have a checkpoint, a waypoint on this project that you don't have on most projects. So sometime in about 3 to 4 years, 5 years, there will be a question, how did we do so far and where do we go from here? And that decision has not been made. So a major focus now on how is it performing, what are we learning, what are the lessons, how are things changing, and do we want to take the next step? That's still there. And a major focus on that and being sure that all of the information and all of the issues and everything is in place for that next decision, that is still manageable. Now, either you build the bridge or you don't, in a sense, or either you build a big dig mostly, but once you start with the tunnel, you pretty much have to finish it. But there will be checkpoints and there will be evaluation points on the high-speed rail project where you can sit back and say, how are we doing? What have we accomplished? And then, again, in a sense, re-ask the original questions. Now that we know what we know, and now that we know what the sources of funding are or aren't at the time, then, what do we get out of it and where do we go from here?
I think that's a point well taken. I think this committee can take some credit for that, and our former chair, who's now a member of Congress, can take some credit for, along with Senator Simiti and with the High-Speed Rail Authority and the administration. And I should say the legislature changed on the bridge as well. The legislation in 2005 that created the joint governance did a lot to start to control the cost. Alexander, it's late in the UK. Do you have any concluding comments?
I just observed that we discussed a lot of ideas today here, and I think there's a lot of ideas here in the room, and there's a lot of ideas out there in the industry. And I think just this hearing alone is a great testament to the will and to the realization that these problems that we've seen on past projects are not technological in nature. They're organizational, they're political, they're human, and this is a great step in actually really improving the value that the political process and the planning process, and particularly the decisions that are to be made, are going to provide to the taxpayers, so the people who are ultimately paying for this.
Well, and we want to bring out the best in humanity, not the worst or the mediocre but I want to take a moment before I thank you all and maybe make a suggestion on next steps to just read a statement that Senator Cannella wanted me to read into the record, and his statement is, and I quote, "As an engineer, I know firsthand just how important it is to maintain public confidence in transportation infrastructure. As the state continues to grow, we will be undertaking many more megaprojects affecting our water and transportation systems. It is important, therefore, that we rise above partisanship and work together to craft an approach that avoids the kinds of mistakes that we are examining today, so we can rebuild the credibility of Caltrans in the eyes of the public. We want to be able to learn from the mistakes in the Bay Bridge and work to implement the lessons learned on the development of any future megaprojects." So I would say well said in the spirit of nonpartisanship, bipartisanship. I want to thank all of you very much for being participants today, and I would hope that you can continue to engage the committee and its staff. It would be wonderful to come up with at least a series of legislative ideas that would minimize what has happened in the Bay Bridge in future projects, whether they be mega projects or not. So just a last reference to the general public, we will be setting a date for the next hearing in the near future. It's still to be determined. We are planning on having one of these hearings in the Bay Area, so we'd be close to the people who are most affected. So please just stay tuned to our website or feel free to contact us. So with that, we are adjourned. Good evening. On this particular item, you can come forward now. Is there anyone? Not seeing anyone? We are adjourned again. Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Shuck.
Will Shuck from Caltrans. The director wanted to convey to you his appreciation for this conversation and for your determination to transparency in our operations and our efforts. And as you know, we've begun, really with your leadership, we've begun to develop some new transparency reporting that we think will head toward the goals that you're heading toward.
Thank you, Mr. Shuck. Sorry that I inhibited your ability to speak publicly. It was not intentional. Yes, sir.
Good afternoon. I'll be brief. Kirk Blackburn of Ellison Wilson, represent the city of La Cañada Flint Ridge. I believe you have a copy of a letter from the city. It discusses their experiences thus far with the current project, the 710 tunnel project. If I may, I'd like to very briefly read a recommendation that the city has from their experiences thus far. We firmly believe that if a full, independently funded and completed cost-benefit study was required for every mega project, then cost overruns would be much more limited and informed decision-making would be enhanced. So certainly thank everyone for a very informative and important hearing today, and certainly offer up the city and its experiences as a resource for the committee going forward.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And again, I apologize for jumping the gun on public comment. I don't think it was intentional, but maybe it was subliminal. Anyone else on public comment? I did want to add one thing. The committee and I have gotten a lot of people who have information about this particular project who feel that they would like to express themselves but have some reservations for whatever reason. And if there are people out there who would like to comment on their experience, whether they were employees of Caltrans or contractors, or if they're observers in some other way, they can feel free to contact my office. And whatever you give us vis-a-vis information will be considered and will be kept in all confidence if that's your desire. So I'll try one last time. We're adjourned.